Alright, I'm just gonna come out and say it. Why the hell did it take Jedah so long to get into a versus game? Jedah is one of the coolest character designs to come out of Darkstalkers, and considering how many characters from that series you can say that about, that says a lot. Jedah Doma is the main antagonist of the third Darkstalkers game, the Immaculate Vampire Savior. If you've never played it, you should really rectify that. It's peak Capcom. The original subtitle for Vampire Savior outside of Japan was Jedah's Damnation, as seen by leftover assets in the arcade ROM. But they ended up going with the Lord of Vampire for the arcade release, and simply Darkstalkers 3 for the American PS1 release. Jedah was one of the High Nobles of Makai, the Demon Realm in Darkstalkers, and notably the youngest one, despite being over 6,000 years old. He was opposed to the noble Belial, the father of Morrigan, who he believed would let Makai deteriorate over time as the natural course of things. Jedah believed that the Makai realm was destined for so much more, and plotted to overthrow Belial in order to forge a future of his making for Makai. However, Jedah was betrayed by a character named Ozam, who was originally shown to have ties with Lord Raptor. Ozam was one of Jedah's attendants, but upon the discovery of a magical portal containing a ton of destructive energy, and realizing that Jedah's ambitions would lead to him being destroyed by consuming that much energy, he goads Jedah into attempting to consume the portal. It ends up temporarily destroying Jedah, and Ozam ends up taking advantage of the power vacuum in the Makai realm. A century later, Jedah is resurrected, and he isn't even mad at Ozam. Well, mostly. With Belial having passed on while Jedah was away, Jedah sees the state of the Makai realm and decides that it needs salvation. He comes upon Ozam, who understandably freaks out, but Jedah basically tells him, hey man, no hard feelings, I get it. But I'm gonna need your soul to create a new dimension so that I can birth a new being that can bring salvation to Makai. Jedah's plan was to unite all souls so that he could create and awaken the Shintai, the fetus of God, which is the backdrop for his stage in Vampire Savior. And y'all, have you seen this stage? I mean, yeah, 90s Capcom games had peak aesthetics, but oh boy, this is one of the wildest fighting game stages of all time. In any case, this sets up the conflict for Vampire Savior, with Jedah acting as the final boss for most characters in the game. Jedah is a Shinigami and has the ability to absorb the souls of other beings and add them to his own power, making him one of the most dangerous beings in the Darkstalkers universe. Jedah notably has the ability to weaponize his blood, using it in a multitude of his attacks in Vampire Savior, even having the ability to mutilate himself to harm his opponent. He also has the ability to traverse into other realms, and trust me, that's going to be important later on in this video. Jedah's first appearance in the Versus series was in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, and despite that game's missteps, I think most people will generally agree that Jedah is one of the coolest additions to the game overall. Interestingly, Jedah is one of the only characters in the history of the Versus games to get a redesign specific to this series. While Jedah has always had a collared outfit in Vampire Savior, his new design in Infinite has a lot more gold trimmings on it, likely reflecting his status as a High Noble of Makai. It's kind of a random redesign if I'm being honest, and I think his original design is great and was fine for what it was, but I really do think it's a sign of how much the team that animated him loved this guy. Jedah probably has the best animations of any character in the game that isn't Venom, and boy does it show during fights. Some of his more graphic moves were completely excised here for understandable reasons, but the fact that they were able to put in what they did still speaks volumes. Jedah is voiced in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite by David Kaye. He's been in the voice acting game for a long while, one of his most notable roles being Megatron in Beast Wars. Sidebar, have y'all watched Beast Wars? I know this has like nothing to do with this video, but if you haven't, you really should. Peak Transformers content, and I don't care if I sound biased. He's also lent his voice to other characters in the Transformers mythos in various continuities, as well as other animated productions, like Professor X and Apocalypse in X-Men Evolution, an equally great show, Vandal Savage in Young Justice, various voices in Ben 10 and Teen Titans Go, and so much more. He also notably has a voice filter over him as well, which was also implemented for his voice acting in Vampire Savior, so that's a nice bit of consistency. Before we get into his Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite appearance though, I actually want to detour a bit and talk about some of Jedah's non-Versus series crossover appearances, because he's made a habit of being something of a professional instigator in games outside of Vampire Savior. That said, since Jedah's a Darkstalkers character, I thought it was an appropriate time to bring in someone who's unquestionably an even bigger Darkstalkers fan than I am to highlight these appearances. So, take it away, Thorgi.
Alright, what are we talking about here? Darkstalkers? Love talking about Darkstalkers. You can't stop this guy from talking about Darkstalkers. I've been a Darkstalkers fan since I laid eyes on the original release 30 years ago. And I love Jedah as the big villain in Darkstalkers 3, and while Morgan seems to be the go-to Night Warrior whenever Capcom needs a crossover, I'm glad that Jedah got to show up in at least a few other spots. Sadly, there still isn't a lot to cover here, and what is to cover isn't all that great, but we should still go over it. First up was Capcom Fighting Evolution, and if you want to know how Jedah played in this game, he played like every other character in Capcom Fighting Evolution. Like they did in their original games, but worse. I will say I think the Darkstalkers characters in this game came out a little better than some of the others, simply because they still got to keep their chain combos and EX moves, but he still feels clunkier and slower, and Darkstalkers characters should never feel slow. And of course, they cut out several of his moves. The biggest loss for me has to be his command grab, Blood Passage, and yes, I'm going to use the English translation on these names because no way can I pronounce their original names. But in Blood Passage, he fills the opponent up with blood until they pop, leading to some really over-the-top, goofy animations, because that's kind of what made Darkstalkers special. It was macabre, but was also silly. And if they had kept that move in this crossover game, I would love to have seen how weird and stupid you could have gotten using it on other Capcom characters. So it's a shame that it's gone. Although two interesting changes I have to point out. They turned his counter move, Contempt, into just a regular attack. This is now just his normal DP motion. Kind of odd, can be good for some reasons, bad for others, but it's kind of weird to me that they kept this move in here to begin with because, well, Jedah decapitates himself to do it. Shocked they'd be willing to take the risk of keeping that in this crossover game. And hey, you know what? One positive that I have to give this game, they kept his super, Proof of Servant, and each character does have a unique blood splatter whenever he uses it on them. That actually did take a little work, and when it comes to Capcom Fighting Evolution, any extra work deserves to be pointed out. Although the best thing in Capcom Fighting Evolution had to be the character endings, and in Jedah's ending, you see him about to be challenged by Dante, and you know what? That's actually pretty sick. This is a crossover game, you need some crossover fun. That is indeed some crossover fun right there. That is one point that I have to give you, Capcom Fighting Evolution. And speaking of goofy crossover fun, I know 7th Force is going to cover how Jedah is depicted in MVCI, but one bone I have to pick with that game, I loved all the unique character interactions in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and in this game, there's almost nothing. The only unique exchange I could find with Jedah is on the character select screen. He has one between him and Morgan.
Jedah, prove yourself, daughter of Belial.
And before the match, I found one unique line if he's on a team with Rocket Raccoon. And that is pretty much it. Although I will say Jedah in this game was played by David Kaye, who voiced Megatron in like 5 different Transformers series when I was growing up. So you know what? That's actually pretty good casting. I'm down with that. But as for Jedah's appearances in other games, yeah, there's slim pickings after that. He appears as one of the main villains in Project Cross Zone. Not a lot to point out here. They did write him pretty accurate to how Jedah should be portrayed. And I do like that he actually recognizes Dante and talks about how he thought his dad was weak, continuing Jedah's trend of thinking every other noble demon isn't fit to lead. Also, it's kind of weird how across 3 different crossover games, Jedah and Dante now have a weird rivalry going. The ending of Capcom Fighting Evolution showed the two of them about to fight. They have an exchange in here where Jedah shows contempt for Dante's father, and then they get a standoff scene in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. Capcom, just make Jedah the big villain of Devil May Cry 6 already. Also, just make Devil May Cry 6 already. And then after that, aside from being a card in multiple digital card games, including having one really broken card in Teppen that drives me crazy, the only other game Jedah has appeared in was Cross Edge, a game that despite me owning it for several years now, I still have not actually played it. Listen, I'm a simple man. You tell me that Darkstalkers are in something, I buy it. I don't ask questions about what it is, I just know that I need it. But for this video, I did watch footage of Jedah in Cross Edge, and it looks like he's one of the big bosses of the game. In fact, it looks like the final boss of the game is a monster that was created by Jedah. Or at least unleashed by Jedah. Listen, this thing is like 100 hours long. I couldn't watch all of it for this video. I only watched the parts with the Darkstalkers characters in there. That's all that I cared about. Point is, this is a crossover game with several characters from different IPs as well as this game's own original characters, and they still decided to give Jedah a spot at the top, which is pretty cool. Also, there are a few exchanges in here between him and other characters such as Lilith that build on what was established in Darkstalkers 3, so that's kinda nice. But as for the rest of his dialogue, holy cow. This is easily the most long-winded Jedah has ever been. Like, Jedah loves the sound of his own voice. That dude will pontificate at the drop of a hat. But he just drones on and on in this story. Kinda like I've been droning on and on in this description. So there you go, I'm gonna wrap up here. That's a brief rundown of Jedah's appearances in other franchises. Thanks for having me on. Back to you.
Alright, before we talk about Jedah's moveset, we probably need to talk about his theme song. Jedah's theme in Infinite is a remix of his stage theme from Vampire Savior, Fetus of God. The original theme was this fast tempo piece that really highlighted just how insane Jedah and his ambitions were. I mean, come on, there's a literal demonic fetus in the background of that stage. Such splendor deserves a music track befitting of that insanity. The Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite arrangement is more of a dance remix of the song, and I'm of two minds on it. On one hand, it's in line with Morrigan's theme in the same game, which is a dance remix of her Vampire Hunter theme, a remix I'm actually kinda fond of, and I'll talk more about it in the eventual Morrigan video. But on the other hand, while I like this arrangement, I don't know if I'd say it fits Jedah all that much. Good track, just kind of the wrong game to use it for. So, Jedah is decidedly considered low tier in Vampire Savior, but weirdly enough, he usually ends up in the higher tiers in crossover fighters, Infinite included. He's one of the most effective rushdown characters in Infinite's roster, bolstered by the fact that his moveset allows for some really potent pressure. Between his angled ground dash, his air dash, and his flight mode, he has fantastic mobility. Said pressure and mobility make him a useful asset on just about any team, and his projectile game in particular allows for some pretty tricky set play. That said, his projectile is just about his only ranged option in his moveset, and his level 3 isn't quite as tricky on activation as the move is in Vampire Savior, since you can't control where the move will grab the opponent. As I noted earlier, some of Jedah's more gruesome attacks had to be edited or completely excised, likely to keep up the game's ESRB rating. Typically in sprite-based games, it's far easier to get away with that stuff since it falls under the cartoon violence descriptor. Notably, the blood dripping from his idle pose and in some of his attacks are now purple. This is actually consistent with the PS1 port of Vampire Savior, which also enacted similar visual changes outside of Japan. Jedah is also similar to Morrigan in that he has an atypical air dash, traveling diagonally upwards both backwards and forwards, and holding the direction allows him to travel towards it longer. Like most characters coming from either previous Versus games or their home fighting game series to Infinite, most of their old medium normals were made into command normals here instead. Also like in Darkstalkers, Jedah's localized move names are all in Italian. I'll give the meanings for each move name as we go. Jedah's first command normal is Jedah d'Elemento, done with forward and light punch. This used to be his standing medium punch in Vampire Savior. Jedah d'Elemento translates to Fingers of Lament. Fauce Morale is done with down forward and light punch. It's a crouching version of the previous move, and was also his crouching medium punch in Vampire Savior. Fauce Morale translates to Mortal Scythe. Jedah de la Pieta is done with down forward and light kick. This one was his crouching medium kick in Vampire Savior. This translates to Fingers of Mercy. Colpo de la Oscuridad is done by crouching and pressing heavy punch.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
This was Jedah's crouching heavy punch in Vampire Savior. The move name translates to Darkness Strike. Next up is Jedah de la Calma, done with forward and light punch in the air. This was his jumping medium punch in Vampire Savior. Jedah de la Calma translates to Fingers of Calm. Jedah's first special move is Spirale Divina, done with a quarter circle forward and punch. Jedah throws out a spinning buzzsaw-like projectile that stays in place, does multiple hits before disappearing, and can be charged by holding down a button. The light version comes out lower to the ground, while the heavy version comes out higher. Letting these out on screen is great for establishing some pressure on your opponent and can notably lock them down, allowing for some tricky high-low mix-up setups. The move name translates into Divine Spiral, and is largely a powered-up version of his Deosega special move in Vampire Savior, Deosega translating to God Saw. Next up is Fauce Initia, done with a quarter circle forward and kick. Jedah does a large swipe with his scythe, the strength of the kick button determining how far ahead the attack goes. Though he's always had a normal in his moveset that involves a scythe, this move's unique to Marvel Infinite and translates to Sickle Start. Next up is Sangue Sacrificale.
Your ultimate! We can do! Destroy!
This one's a hit grab, and if you get caught in it, Jedah imprisons the opponent in a spear before slashing through said spear. This one translates to Blood Sacrifice, and is essentially a renamed version of his Neurofatica attack in Vampire Savior. Next up is Fauce Primordiale, done with a quarter circle back and punch in the air.
Where are you going? The last bit of life is released! Good!
This one's uniquely an air-to-ground command grab. The startup of the move is taken from his Ida Spinto command grab in Vampire Savior, but everything else is original. This move translates to Primordial Scythe. Next up is Doloreo Scodo, done with a quarter circle forward and kick in the air. Jedah tucks himself into a spinning scythe and moves forward. This move translates to Dark Pain. Next is Turbine de Lida, done with a quarter circle back and kick in the air. Jedah leaps into the air before diving down with a spinning blade. This is the primary version of Ida Spinto in Vampire Savior. This translates to Whirlwind of Wrath. Jedah also gets a full-on flight mode here, done with a quarter circle back and 2 kicks. It's not the most practical flight mode, at least relative to the rest of the cast that have the same ability, but it's neat that it's there. This is based off of his Dark Force ability in Vampire Savior, which works mostly the same way. Jedah's first hyper combo is Finale Doso, done with a quarter circle back and 2 punches.
Did you enjoy?
Some bloody hands grab the opponent and drag them down to get pummeled by other bloody hands. This was a down-down 2-punch motion in Vampire Savior, and considering how much Marvel Infinite loved giving characters that input, I'm a little shocked they didn't try it here. I do prefer the quarter circle forward motion more though, so no harm no foul. This translates to Red Finale. Next is Spirale Infernale, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 kicks in the air.
Maxima! Kneel! Rip apart! No need for the trappings of flesh.
This one's essentially a powered-up version of Doloreo Scodo. This translates to Inferno Spiral. Jedah's level 3 is Sigia del Servo, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 kicks on the ground.
At this end, I shall put your affairs in order. Maxima! Surrender your life to me. Every path has its end. I shall put your affairs in order.
A bloody hand comes out of the ground and attempts to grab the opponent. If successful, it batters them before slamming their body on a giant magical contract. Unlike in Vampire Savior, you have no degree of control over where to spawn the hand, so its range is a lot more limited. Still, it's one of Jedah's most iconic moves, and I'm glad they kept it here. This translates to Seal of the Servant. Here are Jedah's colors. Color 2 is based off of his red color scheme in Vampire Savior. Color 4 is loosely based off of the color scheme of Angelo Credo in Devil May Cry 4. Jedah, not really straying too much from his original design in crossovers, Infinite notwithstanding, and even then, didn't really have anything to pull from for an alternate costume, so an original mechanical looking one for him was created instead. Jedah doesn't have as many character interactions as some other characters, but he does have a few.
It's you again. You'll never learn, son of Sparta.
When I beat you, you're gonna tell me everything about my dad.
Are you a god? That should make things easier.
I will send thee to meet Hela. Prepare thyself!
Your role is finished. Mistress Death will be most happy.
Surrender all hope. Your ruler has arrived.
I understand your opinion. I just don't care about it.
Why try to fight us? We who are God!
An intriguing form, but no worthy vessel for a soul.
Do you think you can defeat us?
Grant me access to the power of creation and destruction.
You may not be a minion of Dormammu, but I shall banish you nonetheless.
My power is truly greater.
Friend, I do not have this term in my memory.
You are like a delicate rose blossoming moments before a storm.
Compared to the threats to the galaxy that we've faced, this is easy.
Darkstalkers is somewhat represented in Marvel Infinite stage roster via the Dark Kingdom, a combination of Dormammu's Dark Dimension and the Makai Kingdom from Darkstalkers. Given the monstrosity in the center of the stage, it's definitely meant to be a less gruesome looking shoutout to Jedah's Fetus of God stage in Vampire Savior. This one has some relevance to Marvel Infinite's story. There, after the Capcom and Marvel worlds merge, Jedah uses the Soul Stone to siphon souls from the merged world to feed into this symbiote weapon, which he plans to use against Ultron Sigma. Ghost Rider tracks him down before Morrigan and the rest of the cast eventually catch up. On the top and bottom of the structure where the symbiote is, there's green swirling portals where the souls it consumes are taken from. These portals are likely also linked to Umbrella, where the symbiote weapon was first created. On top of the structure, there are carvings of some kind of demon. On the bottom, closer to the lower portal, there's also some gargoyle-looking demon carvings as well. If you zoom in close to the symbiote, you can see the makeshift heart inside of it beating. Eerie. Looking up past the symbiote, you can see all sorts of castles on their own isolated floating outcroppings. It reminds me of the few times we've seen the Makai Kingdom in other fighting games like in Darkstalkers proper and in Pocket Fighter. Speaking of, and this isn't actually viewable as far as I can remember without using a free camera mod in the PC version, there's a whole ass rendered castle out of view if you swing the game camera around directly opposite of the symbiote cradle. I can't remember if we ever see this castle in the story mode or not, but it's kind of funny that it's there and even properly textured, but just not used in any capacity viewable to the player. The sky also looks pretty freaky as well, no doubt due to the influence of the Dark Dimension. There's an alternate version of this stage as well, but it's just wastelands, with the only notable background element being the aforementioned castles in the sky. Jedah's place in the story mode is actually kind of interesting. Though Ultron Sigma is the game's main antagonist, it's eventually revealed that the entire thing only happened because of some multiversal instigation from Jedah. He travels to the Marvel Universe and runs into Death. He proposes an alliance to bring equilibrium to both worlds by combining them and taking the souls of beings from both worlds. Death agrees, and knowing that Thanos would do anything for her, sends him on a mission to collect the Infinity Stones. He recruits some of the other folks like Ultron for the cause, who ends up in the world of the Mega Man X games and runs across Sigma, who he forms his own alliance with, which leads to the birth of Ultron Sigma, and well, there we go. Basically, if Jedah hadn't been dicking around in other universes for no reason, this wouldn't have happened. It's funny, though it's also weirdly consistent with his appearance in other crossovers. Also, Thorgi touched on this earlier, but I really appreciate that Capcom actually kind of made good on that confrontation from Jedah's ending in Capcom Fighting Evolution. Hell, even the scene is framed similarly. Someone there really wants that rivalry to be a thing, and I'm kind of here for it. Since the chances of another Darkstalkers game happening are next to zero these days, the Versus games have been something of a makeshift retirement home for the cast. We'll probably never stop seeing Morrigan in these games, but part of the fun of these Versus series rosters sometimes is seeing if she'll bring someone along with her. This time around it was Jedah, and it was long overdue. Like most newcomers in Infinite, he's honestly executed really well, even if they had to tone down some of his more gruesome attacks. If another Capcom Fighting crossover happens, I'd hope they consider him for that game too. That's going to do it for this video. Huge thanks to Thorgi for taking time out of his busy schedule to be a part of this episode, and if by some weird, unlikely circumstance you aren't already subscribed to him, go ahead and do that. His fighting game retrospectives and roster building videos are must-see fighting game content. As always, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.